So tonight we do our 11th Witness to History event. It's called Attica Beyond the Riot. The Witness to History program, again, is being operated under the auspices of the National Law Enforcement Museum. Tonight's event is being filmed by the museum, and this event will become a permanent part of the historical archives for the museum. Now, a little background before I turn things over to our moderator and our panel. On the walls of the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial are the names of 633 corrections professionals, and some 500,000 correctional officers risk their lives daily, providing for the custody and security of more than 2 million inmates in jails and prisons across our nation. Too often, those corrections professionals are underappreciated. And tonight you'll get a sense of what it's like to be a corrections professional working in very difficult and dangerous circumstances. Tonight we explore how in 1971 the most infamous prison riot in American history occurred at the Attica Correctional Facility in Attica, New York, when it was over 7 correctional officers were dead. And I'd like to read their names here tonight. William Quinn, Edward Cunningham, John DiArcangelo Jr., Richard Lewis, Carl Vallone, Ronald Werner, and Harrison Whalen. 7 correctional officers killed in the Attica prison riot. Also among the dead were 4 civilian hostages and 33 inmates. Many prison reforms followed, and there was a great and long-standing controversy surrounding the actions taken that led to so much bloodshed, and we're going to be talking about that here tonight. And tonight, to help us tell the story of Attica behind the riot, is a distinguished panel, including 2 of the correctional officers who served in Attica in 1971. You have Donald Almeter and Michael Smith, and a university professor who has written a book about Attica to be published this year, Dr. Heather Ann Thompson. Look forward to hearing from each of them. And I also want to acknowledge another very special guest in the audience, Mr. John Stockholm. John, thank you so much for joining us here tonight. John was a correctional officer, and he was taken hostage in 1971 during the Attica prison riot. So he's come to join us here tonight for this discussion. Our distinguished moderator for this evening's program is Frank Bond, a journalist who has produced a number of award-winning documentaries for the museum, where he has worked since 1999. Before that, he had a 23-year career in television news. Many of us locals will remember that Frank was a reporter and an anchor here in Washington at WUSA-TV 9. So at this time, please join me in welcoming our esteemed panelist and moderator for this evening's Witness to History, Attica Behind the Riot. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. Let me add my welcome. Thank you for coming out tonight. You know, Craig reminded me how much age I'm putting on because I actually covered the dedication of the Law Enforcement Memorial when it first opened. Prior to that, the ceremony that was still moving was held on the west front of the Capitol. And it's really something, I don't know if you ever happen to be in Washington when they have their annual Law Enforcement Day, to come and see the law enforcement officers who come from all over the country and remind us of that even line, the people that dedicate their lives to keeping us all safe and whole as we go about our lives. This evening's program is an important discussion that we're going to have because, like so many events that took place in the tumultuous 60s and 70s, the prison riot at Attica set into motion a number of responses from the public, from state and federal government, from the corrections community, and not all of the fallout has yet been unraveled and put into its proper place. Well, our 3 panelists this evening are eminently qualified to tell us about what happened then, and then give us some insight as to where we are now and what ground we have yet to cover. First, let me introduce on my left Michael Smith, who was 22 years old when the 1971 Attica prison riot changed his life. The young correctional officer sustained massive injuries and was in recovery for several years. Today, Smith serves as the spokesman for the Forgotten Victims of Attica, an advocacy group started by D. Quinn Miller, the daughter of slain Attica Correctional Officer William Quinn. Together, Smith and Miller speak out about the devastating cost of the riot, and they serve as advocates for the correctional officers who were held hostage and their families. To To my right, Donald Almeter was also a young correctional officer at Attica when he was taken hostage by inmates during the riot. Almeter returned to correctional work in New York and later retired from the profession. Today, he volunteers with the Correctional Peace Officers Foundation to educate the public on the importance of correctional work and advocate for the well-being of all corrections officers. Finally, Dr. Heather Ann Thompson is a professor of African American Studies and History at Temple University. She recently completed the first comprehensive history of the Attica prison riot, due to be published this year. She's contributed to numerous scholarly and popular publications on topics of Attica, prison reform, and the history of incarceration in the United States. That's your panel. They have so much to offer. Please welcome them. I'm going to have each of you contribute to setting the stage for this discussion. So Donald, I want to start with you. If you can tell us what Attica was like prior to the riots. What was the environment like for the corrections officers, for the inmate population? Were there warning signs that pressure was building up? If so, how were they dealt with?
Well, the pressures were always there, and we knew it. With the riots were happening out in California, and we had there was a riot in Auburn in 1970 where they took hostages, poured gas on them. The state police came in and quelled it. We could feel it building up in Attica, just the way the inmates were acting, the way they were behaving. They were going on protests, refusing to eat, and it just kept getting worse. The administration had been notified of it. The unions had wanted more help to be kept over during the day shift when they were allowing large numbers out, and the state's answer was, we're not going to spend a couple $100 on overtime and it'll work out.
Dr. Thompson, what did your research indicate about conditions at Attica from the inmate standpoint? What was the experience like? What was the relationship like between the inmate population and the correctional officers working there?
Well, I think it was very complicated. On the one hand, I think it was a very tense environment for everybody because there was severe overcrowding. There were far too many people in the institution for what it was supposed to hold to start with. It was difficult for the corrections officers because they felt unsafe. They felt like they needed more support. Oftentimes being in charge of so many people at the same time, people who themselves had very I would argue, quite legitimate concerns about their conditions of confinement. And so the entire environment was very, very tense. And as Don mentioned, the administration of the prison was just completely unwilling to take these concerns seriously. Either the prisoner concerns that they needed more than one shower a month, that they needed basic things like toilet paper on the one hand, and on the other hand, completely turning a deaf ear to the corrections officers who felt very much that they were put in jeopardy. As for the relationships between them, I think it was complicated. I think that some corrections officers had quite good relationships with the people over whom, the people whom they kept as prisoners. I think there were also tense relationships. I don't think we can generalize, but I think what we can say for sure is that the administration was well aware that this was a problem that needed fixing for many partners, and indeed put everyone in jeopardy rather than fix them.
So Michael, you're on the front line. Take us back to the beginning take us back to the day before the riot began, and then take us up to the moment that the violence erupted, and take us through that scenario.
The day before the Wednesday, September 8th, the day before the riot actually began, there was an incident in one of the recreation yards where officers mistook two inmates that were sparring for the real thing. And as the ranking officer and the correction officers approached the two inmates that were involved, one of the inmates blended into the crowd of inmates in the yard, and the other inmate tried to explain himself that they were only sparring in jest. And the ranking officer didn't listen, wouldn't really give an ear to what the inmate was trying to say. The inmate wanted to make his point and physically pushed the officer to get his point made. And that was something that never happened in prison. People respect each other's personal space. Inmates, unless there's an altercation, obviously inmates don't touch inmates, and officers don't touch inmates, and inmates don't touch officers. That set a precedent. And everyone in the yard, all the inmates in the yard and the officers gathered around the area where that happened. So that set a precedent, but the second precedent that was also set during that event was that a correctional officer doesn't back down from the situation either. And they didn't press the issue. Their intent was to segregate that inmate and remove him to a different area of the prison where the issue could be dealt with. That didn't happen. The officers backed off. And that set the stage for what followed. The state formulated a plan, or the administration formulated a plan, that evening that they would extricate the 2 inmates involved in the altercation in the yard from their cells. And when officers went to remove one of the inmates, other inmates locked in their cells reacted violently and threw all kinds of objects out of their cells. And correction officers were able to extract the violator, if you will, from his cell and remove him to a different area of the prison. But there was such a fracas that they formulated another plan. And that was that the following morning, when the inmates were locked in their cells, that when they were released for breakfast, the other inmate involved in the incident would not be released with the rest of his company and allowed to go to breakfast. They'd go down to get him when they didn't have to worry about the rest of the population reacting to it, take the guy out of his cell. As Heather indicated, the facility was severely overpopulated at that time. It was built to house about 1,600 inmates, and at that time, the summer of '71, there were 2,200 there. When inmates were released for breakfast the following morning, each correction officer controlled 2 companies, which is approximately 2 companies, approximately 80 people total on 2 different galleries, 1 floor. And when the inmates were released off that company to go to breakfast, one of the inmates, as they passed by the lockbox that controls the door opening and closing of the cells, reached over and cracked open the door of one of the other inmate that was involved, and he went to breakfast with the rest of the population. The count, who was in their cell, who was out of their cell, that followed them going to breakfast that morning indicated that it was discovered that that inmate was released and went to breakfast with the population. They formulated another plan, and that plan was that as the companies came back from breakfast and went to their respective recreation yards to be dispersed to their jobs, which occurred every morning after breakfast or wherever they, some had recreation, some had jobs that they went to, but they all went to the recreation yard, which there are 4 recreation yards there. And as they progressed from breakfast back through the maze, if you will, of above ground hallway system, as they went through that above ground corridor system, you have a central meeting place called Times Square is the main intersection in that tunnel system. And when you're in prison, a gate closes behind you before the one in front of you opens. As they progressed through that process, it was a time of morning when there was a lot of traffic. Prison traffic was at its peak. People are going to jobs, people are going to breakfast, people are going to the hospitals, people are going to their work details. And so there's a lot of inmate traffic. There was an officer that controlled the Times Square gate system, which was 4 physically huge metal gates controlled by a skeleton type key. And he controlled the traffic through those gates. The inmates came back from breakfast, progressed through Times Square, turned toward, this company came from A block, turned toward A block, and the door that would have been customarily every day opened into the recreation yard was closed and locked, as well as the gate in front of them, the A block gate. And when the gate closed behind them, they suspected something was up. The A block door gate opened, and officers, a number of officers came from the A block area, and their intent was to grab the other inmate that was involved in the incident the day before and remove him, isolate him from the rest of the company. And as officers approached the company, inmates knew something was up and assaulted the officers. That seemed to be the ignition that lit the flame for the explosion that followed. All of these inmates were locked in the A gate tunnel, and all this energy, human energy, turned back toward Times Square. And when they physically hit the gate, there was a fault in the gates where 2 metal parts didn't connect and had been painted over for years. The whole gate gave way under the human force behind it. They attacked the officer in Times Square, Bill Quinn, and took control of his keys, took the telephone out of Times Square, which effectively eliminated communication in the prison. It was a very antiquated communication system. And from there, it just spread like wildfire. They opened the gates, and they were already out of their cells, the biggest share of the population. And the officers were so outnumbered that it was easily taken control of.
Mm-hmm. Don, I want you to amplify this. Most people have never been inside a corrections facility. Clearly, routine is the first layer of security. You want to move prisoners in a certain way at a certain time every day.
We were actually moving large numbers of prisoners back then. You could be going to the evening or morning chow or late chow, or be taking as many as between 80 and 100 inmates down the corridors, which are a little over 100 yards. They were already through the square before you actually got there. There was actually no control. We tried to, just so you know, we're talking 1970, we're antiquated. We did what they called the salt and pepper. You know, white guy, black guy, white guy, black guy, tall guys in the front, short guys in the back. So the officer actually, you know, we're all about the same height, 5'10", and you could actually see what the front guys were doing. Even you could see what they were doing, you still had no control. They were through the square area before you left the housing block. You know, like I say, the yards are 1 by 1, 100 by 100, and the corridors are only a little over 100, and they all pass through the magical Times Square. Like Mike said, when they got inmates were locked in there and they kept manpower just pushing on the gate was faulty. No one ever knew it, and the gate gave way. And once it gave way, those inmates, they were smarter than we thought they were. They actually knew that they had the keys to get any place in that jail they wanted. They did. They proved it. They were going into housing blocks. They came into B block where I was. I had the keys for the gate in my pocket, and they opened the door. You know, throughout the years, the locks were old, antiquated. One key would start in A block and take you all the way back by the metal shops down to E block. That's all changed now. We're a little more secure at the facility now, and I talked to a lot of guys that work there. They still do the 40, I believe, in the company, and probably the only jail in the whole state of New York that has allowed 40 inmates at one time in a corridor with one officer.
It sounds like when the routine is broken, the corrections officers, you're kind of flying by the seat of your pants in terms of not losing total control. Once that routine is broken.
Oh, once it was broke, they had no control. They were out in the open. I mean, they had a little door where they could peek out where the one guy stood. Didn't take much to break that metal door down. They broke the main gate. Officer Quinn, who was actually working that day, and what a lot of people don't know, he was actually working his day off. He was performing a swap for a guy that he owed a day for, and he died when he went to work on his day off. Beat on the first day, died on the third day.
Dr. Thompson, talk to me about the inmate population that may not have been a part of the original melee. When you're an inmate in a prison and a riot erupts, what kind of choices do you have?
Well, I think that this is sort of what I was saying originally about how it kind of all goes back, even this event goes back to preventable, to questions of prevention. So again, had all of those people, I think all of those people felt that change needed to happen. The officers who were put in this position, what's interesting about the story that Mike tells, you know, where people are actually prevented from going to the rec yard, locked in that one hallway, from what I understood, the officers themselves, the people in charge of those prisoners, were not given particularly the choice of whether that was a good idea or not. Essentially, the administration says, you're not letting these guys out to the yard. Well, of course, that put them in a very unsafe position. You've got all these people locked between two gates. They're panicking. Everyone is it's tense, you know. So again, preventable. So for the rest of the prisoners, I mean, it's just all kinds of complicated stories. Some of them were looking at this happening over, hearing it and looking at it, and we're actually asking Bill Quinn, who they mentioned was in charge of Times Square, you know, please let us in, because they thought they'd be protected in Times Square. Some of them were actually asking to be let in for some protection. Others were just confused. They didn't know what was happening. I mean, you have to understand, I think this was happening so quickly. It was complete chaos so quickly. People were afraid. They didn't know, was this, you know, what kind of a uprising was this? What was happening? And so I think initially people very much wanted to just kind of protect themselves and get safe. And some of them actually protected some of the corrections officers. Some of them were very violent to the corrections officers, kind of depended. But at the end of the day, what was very interesting was that at least some of the prisoners had, I think, the foresight really to think, if you think about this as probably what actually saved a lot of lives, which was to move everybody to one place out in the open, which was D Yard. And then the hostages who had been taken, including these two gentlemen and John Stockholm sitting here, were placed in one specific area out in the open. And so then I think everybody else has to kind of come out into the open to at least have some measure of safety. So very quickly, what was very chaotic turned into a much more organized kind of, kind of goes from a riot to more of a, I guess, a formal rebellion or something, whereas each of the prisoner blocks elect someone to speak for them. There's an actual negotiating team. They ask for observers to come in to help oversee these negotiations with the state of New York. And they initially ask for certain people, some of whom arrive, some of whom don't. The state also adds their own people to this observers committee. And that's when this 4-day process begins of trying to negotiate better conditions for the prisoners. But it's really historic because there's television cameras. This thing is being televised across the nation, across the world. And so all eyes were riveted on Attica. Everything was taking place, both on television, but also, I mean, on the radio. Everyone was sitting, you know, every night watching this unfold. And so it went from something very chaotic, I think, to something much more contained and much more organized. And so that's often what we see when we see the footage. We see those, you know, the speeches, and then you'll see the footage of all these gentlemen who are in one area in the yard.
And we're going to see that in just a little bit. But once again, what we've heard is that these two corrections officers in a heartbeat go from being in charge of inmates to hostages. I want to hear both of your stories Don, let's start with you. You're there. Tell me when it turned and what happened.
Okay, I started off in B block, which is mainly a metal shop building. All the workers live there. When we had the trouble, we got the call that the company was locked in the corridor. And so the guy that I was working with, we called him a hall captain, he said, go to the square and find out what's going on. So I went down and I talked to Quinn and a couple other officers. And their answer to me was, the yard door is locked, we're going to get the key, and we're actually going to allow him to go out into the yard. And we know Lewis is in the block by himself, well, why don't you go back to the block with Lewis? So I went back, I explained to Lewis. He said, we have no phone communications, I can't get a hold of nobody. We had what we call a bitch box between the square and the blocks. That didn't work half the time. So he locked me out of the block. I was behind B block with the 2 keys in my pocket. After they broke through Times Square, they came running down to B block, and you could hear them. They were breaking the windows, and it was total chaos. And someone said, get the keys. And I kind of laughed because I got the keys. They ain't getting them from me. They were smart enough that they went back and got the keys from Times Square and actually came and opened the gates in B block and actually opened the next set of gates and went, you were in Metal 1, right, Mike?
Yeah,
and they actually had access. We had locked the riot gates, which they broke down anyways. Michael was taken in Metal 1. I ended up in the fire building with the Sergeant Cunningham, who ended up getting killed. And the whistle was blowing, and his answer to all of us was, there'll be enough help here in a little while. Don't worry, they'll be coming in to get us. Well, that didn't happen. The only ones that came in to get us were the inmates. And when they came in, they started beating the officers, stripping you, ripping your clothes off. And then someone said, get them to the yard. And they run us down through a gauntlet. And down through the hallway we went. Most guys were barefoot, running on the broken glass. I still had my shoes on. I don't know why, but every time you'd bend over to take them over, some guy would hit you. So they ran us down there, naked, of course. And we get out there and our lily white asses are hanging out, All of a sudden, one of the inmates go, this is going to last a while, and we're actually in control because we've already made our demands. We want the news. We want certain negotiators. So they decided to dress us. And what they did is they dressed us in inmate clothing. It was better than nothing.
Wow. Michael, in the meantime, you were undergoing your own ordeal. Tell us about it.
I was located, excuse me, like Donnie said, in Metal 1, which is near the rear of the prison, near the powerhouse. And I was on a 2nd level floor. Inmates constructed and painted state institution lockers in that area at that time. Main metal shop was right directly below me with all the machines. And on the south side of the room that I was in, you could look out of the 2nd story and look down into a garage area on the main ground. And you could tell something was happening. I was in charge of about 6 civilians that morning, civilian instructors. Their offices was in my area. And I was 22 years old at the time. Never really had any formal training. It was pretty much on-the-job training in the truest sense of the phrase. I'd worked at another prison and transferred to Attica. Anyway, you could hear the prison whistle blowing, and there wasn't a guidebook like when the no signal indication, like the whistle blows so many times, that means this is happening. The thing just blew incessantly. The other time that I'd ever heard the prison whistle blow is when they had an escape. So you could look out those 2nd story windows. The inmates in my area looked out those 2nd story windows, and you could see on the ground level below inmates running around in an unsupervised fashion, grabbing whatever they could, football helmets, protective, some type of weapon, wrenches, screwdrivers, hammers, whatever they could to protect themselves. There are several gangs represented in the prison society inside the walls. And the inmates that were under my supervision were scared. They were as scared as I was. And they thought that it was some type of gang trying to take care of, or trying to take control of the facility, some type of gang riot. So inmates took up, in my area, took up weapons to protect themselves and actually physically tried to fit themselves into the lockers, which would be the equivalent of a high school locker. A short time thereafter, you could hear the rioting inmates as they came through B block and back to the machine shop area, ramming a gate with one of the machines, one of the forklift machines from the shop down below. So you knew what was going on. And I had locked the civilian instructors in their offices in the rear of that room and taken up a post near the front of the room. The inmates had pretty much all hidden themselves that were under my supervision. Wasn't long thereafter, and you could see angry inmates gather outside the entry doors to that room, and eventually my keys were ripped from my belt, the door was open, and the rioting inmates broke in. When they first broke into the room, I was knocked to the floor and beaten. And as I lay there on the floor, I can recall I had the wind knocked out of me, and as I laid there with the inmates kicking me and beating me, two inmates that I knew went spread eagle over my body with their hands against the wall and their feet in front of my side and said, "Leave him alone, he's a good guy." With that, this huge wave of angry emotion passed me and went to the rear of that room, broke down the office doors, took the civilian hostages, the civilian instructors hostages, and just as quickly as this human wave of emotion came rushing in, they rushed back out and left me alone in the room with the two inmates that had protected me. Two inmates tried to formulate a plan to hide me, but thought that if I was discovered in that area, I may be worse off than if they tried to get me to safety. So they put an arm over either shoulder and tried to escort me from the rear of the prison, the metal shop area, up through the tunnel system, up through Times Square, and where they eventually wanted to get me was to the administration building, which is in the front of the prison. As I was escorted through that area, through all the prison corridor system and through the block, through B block, you could see everything being broken and people running around in a chaotic, unsupervised manner, smashing everything that they could smash and igniting everything on fire that would burn. I made it as far as Times Square. Obvious the inmate population was in control of a good share of the facility. And at Times Square, the inmates had already put up an inmate perimeter to block access to A block in the front of the prison and the administration building. And when my two captors got me to that point, they were directed by inmates that all hostages were to be taken to D Yard, and that's where I was taken.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Thompson, you mentioned media coverage earlier on. This was more than a local story. This was a national story. This was a scary story, not only for that region, but to any place that had a prison nearby. How would you characterize the national media coverage of that time period from the beginning of the riot up to the state police moving in, which we're going to talk about in a minute?
Mm-hmm. Well, it was not just a national news story, it was actually an international news story. One of the reasons for that was that one of the observers at the prison was Tom Wicker from the New York Times, who is a very well-known columnist. And one of the reasons why the prisoners had asked for Tom Wicker was that he had reported previously about various prison reform efforts around the country, so they thought he might be a sympathetic figure. But the minute, of course, that he was there, but not just him, there was also State Senator John Dunn, there was also the quite famous lawyer William Kunstler. There was quite a few luminaries there. So immediately that brought a lot of national and international attention. And it's important to realize that while it was very scary, absolutely, and really a horrific experience for the people that lived it and endured it, at the time in the country, there was actually quite a lot of popular sentiment in favor of prisoner rights, prisoner reform. And one of the reasons for this was that, for example, in the South, there had been these horrible stories of prison abuse that came from, for example, the Arkansas prison farms, and just, that were still really being run like plantations. And so there'd been a lot of media about prison conditions. And so, for example, when polled, Americans were quite sympathetic to it. But then when Attica happens, I think people are kind of waiting on tenterhooks to kind of see, what is this about? What does this mean? And as you mentioned, we'll get to it. But what I would argue is that the way that the state decided to take the prison, that what happened afterwards, had really an incalculable effect on the way the nation would understand Attica afterwards, and the way that the stories of the people who survived it, whether they were hostages or prisoners, really became secondary to a kind of a different story about, about the importance to kind of get stronger law enforcement and so forth, but not really understanding what had led to it to start with.
Mm-hmm. Donald, you had said earlier, one of your colleagues said, just be patient, help will be allowed.
Yeah, we were told once we heard the whistle, usually like Mike said, it was from a walk away from the farm detail or something. He said, we'll have enough help here pretty soon, they'll come in and get us, and we waited and they didn't come, and it was the 5th day before they actually came. I have to say one thing, the state of New York definitely failed in not coming in on the first day, and we all know that. We put blame on everybody, from the governor to the commissioner, even to the correction officers that worked there. We were told we didn't understand the inmates, so therefore, if we didn't understand them, that's why they didn't like us. Well, they didn't like us because they were prisoners and we were guards. San Quentin had an incident. Do you mind if I tell it?
Go.
August 21st, 1971, San Quentin had a riot. George Jackson, we've all heard about him. He had a gun smuggled into special housing. He had actually killed 3 officers, cut 3 officers' throats, and killed a couple inmates and had hostages. A lieutenant by the name of Dick Nelson was living on grounds and he was off duty, painting his ceiling in his kitchen. He got the call. He went to the armory, drew a Thompson submachine gun, ran into special housing, pulled the trigger, killed all the inmates that were in there, saved the hostages, and the 4,000 inmates that were in the recreation yards went back and locked in their cells. It was over in 15 minutes. The state of New York could have done the same thing, and they elected, once they let the inmates get control, by picking who they wanted to come in for negotiation and allowing the news, free forecast, in and out. Mike and I and everybody else who was in the yard were at the mercy of the man upstairs and nobody else.
You provided some video of when the state troopers finally did come in. It wasn't exactly what you expected. We're going to look at the video, and then I want the two of you to talk about that.
Oh, yeah.
So let's roll that videotape that we have.
I can say one thing. I was in Vietnam 11 months and 20-some days. Came back, took the job at the prison. I was more fearful for my life in that 5 days at Attica, being tied up and blindfolded, than I was the whole time I was in Vietnam. Never to expect to come back and be caught in another war in my own hometown, or 8 miles from where I grew up.
Let's look at the videotape.
The hostages are on the catwalks with knives at their throats. Time is 9:45 a.m.
that operation, 39 people were killed, including
Well, actually, a total of 43 died.
altogether.
Inmates had killed 3 of their own. The 2 inmates that actually beat the officer to death. The funny part is when they closed the books on Attica, they were actually pardoned and released from jail.
Michael, when the state troopers began their assault on Attica, what's going through your mind as a hostage?
I was one of the 8 hostages that were randomly chosen to be displayed on top of the catwalk that was just showed in that video. And that was Monday morning when the state of New York mounted their assault to retake the facility. On Sunday evening, the negotiation process had pretty effectively broken down. It seemed to be headed in a positive direction, or we hoped it was anyway, up until the announcement of Bill Quinn's death. And the inmates' demands had primarily been of a humanitarian nature: better food, better education, more real work opportunity to learn a trade, more religious freedoms. Nobody was demanding that they wanted to escape from prison. With the announcement on Sunday night, it was obvious the state of New York was going to break off the negotiation process and had their own plan. In fact, Sunday night they sent in a Catholic priest to the hostage area to administer last rites to anybody that wanted it. And it was pretty evident that this wasn't going to come to a peaceful resolve. Monday morning, I think in kind of a last-ditch effort, the inmates had, and also the inmates' demands at that point in time, after Saturday's announcement of Bill Quinn's death, the officer that was beaten at Times Square, the inmate demand list grew to now I think was 28 demands, as I recall. Yeah. And to include...
The key was amnesty.
The key was amnesty. The key, as Heather said, was amnesty. The inmates had to have amnesty because with the announcement that Bill Quinn died, each inmate could be found guilty of murder as an accessory to the event. And in a last-ditch effort to push their point, the inmates randomly chose 8 hostages from the hostage circle in the yard and put them on the catwalk. Totally irrational. There wasn't a lot of people thinking rationally at that time anyway, but I think the thought was, well, we'll take these 8 hostages, stick them up there in front of everybody, assign inmate executioners to each hostage, and then bargain with the balance of the lives that we have in the yard. The state didn't move from their position, and a helicopter flew over the wall that morning. I was blindfolded. Probably what you'd conjure up as a typical execution scenario. I was blindfolded. I had 3 inmate executioners assigned to me. One was Don Noble, an inmate to my left. I had an inmate behind me with a ball-peen hammer and an inmate to my right side with a hand-fashioned spear that he'd made out of a metal file and ground down to a point in the metal shop and attached a broom handle to. And they were all identified, wore some type of identification that indicated that they were an executioner. The state, first some type of smaller helicopter flew over the wall, and then that was followed by a larger military helicopter. And we were blindfolded. I was blindfolded. My wrists were bound. And I can recall that there was, when the helicopter went overhead, you could feel the concussion of the blades. And there was a loud popping noise that was caused by some type of gas projectile or gas bomb of some sort. Gas was dropped into the yard, and as you watch that video, the reason it looks cloudy is because it was a typical fall in New York. It had rained all evening. The gas rose to the level, hovered on the ground, rose to the level we were, and made everything like looking into a cloud. But with the explosion of that gas projectile, that seemed to signal the rooftops were lined with sharpshooters, if you were New York State employees, made up of correction officers from that facility, correction officers from other facilities, New York State Police, and a number of other state agencies. And they brought in weapons from home. The weapon at the time, the tower duty weapon at the time at Attica was an AR-15 or an M16, which is capable of like 700 rounds per minute. And when that gas exploded, that seemed to be coincidentally signal the open fire signal for the sharpshooters and the retaking of the facility. And all hell broke loose. I mean, you could hear, I'd grown up in a rural area and was familiar with weapons. And you could hear small arms fire, handguns, shotguns, large handguns, .357 Magnums, 270s, bolt-action rifles, and automatic weapons. And the firing went on for about 10 minutes. First, I can remember laying there on the catwalk. I can remember watching the video of the retaking, the frame by frame for identification purposes after. And it was bizarre and surreal to watch yourself get shot. And I can recall the Noble was on my left. There was an inmate behind me with a hammer and an inmate on my right with this hand-fashioned spear. And you can see the inmate on my right. He was an angry individual. I worked around a lot of places in the prison because I worked vacation relief, but I didn't recognize this guy. And he was angry at his circumstance in life. He was angry at what I represented. He was just one generally pissed off person. And in the film, you can see him draw up his spear. He couldn't wait to see my guts spill in the yard. And as he started down with the spear, they shot him. And the impact of the first shot lifted his feet about 3 feet off the catwalk surface. And the second volley, when the second volley hit him, it was almost like he did a backwards pole vault down into the yard below. And I was blindfolded, and Noble pulled at my left shoulder, and he pulled me over, and when he pulled me over, that opened up the executioner behind me, and they took him out. And then I jerked away from Noble, pushed my mask up or my blindfold up, and they hit Noble, and they hit me at the same time. And we all fell in slow motion. It looks like we all fall like dominoes on top of the catwalk.
So Dr. Thompson, we've heard about how the inmates, as irrational as it was, decided on their action. What was the process the state troopers used to decide what to do and how to do it?
Well, so one of the things I would like to say first, one of the interesting things about trying to write the history of Attica, it's taken me 10 years, and one of the reasons it's taken me 10 years, which is longer than any book should ever take to write, is trying to actually get the clear facts of who made what decision and why decisions were made, either in the yard by prisoners or by the state of New York, the actual governor or the commissioner of corrections, or even state troopers as they were proceeding out on the catwalk. And this entire event is shrouded in so much secrecy and indeed a 40-year cover-up, which we can talk about later. But one of the reasons is that indeed this was a very ill-planned retaking, to say the very least, because there was so much ammunition being shot into a very, very small space relatively in a very short amount of time. The video that you saw, one of the most, I mean, if you can just hear it, it's not even just seeing it, you can just hear it. I mean, imagine that this is going into a very small contained space. And so, of course, for the, on the one hand, it looks like the state decided to go in only after the hostages are brought up on the catwalk, right? And they have the executioners at their throat. But in fact, my research indicates that that decision had been made days before. In fact, when the state decides that they're going to go into the prison, they very deliberately did not give the inmates an ultimatum. That was a very deliberate decision coming from the governor's office. And indeed, the men at the highest levels of New York State government were well aware that hostages were going to die when they went in there. And they did it anyway. And so we could debate about when or if they should have gone in, but certainly the way they did go in was horrific. The toll was horrific, not just the death toll, but the injury rate for people was awful. You know, all of the broken glass that had been even in the initial riot, you can imagine now at this point, all the windows are being shot out with this much gunfire. And so for the troopers that go in, this is, again, hugely debatable. The state of New York was told that corrections officers should not go in. It should just be state troopers with the guns. But indeed, corrections officers did participate in the retaking. We'd like to know, for example, exactly who had what weapon. You know, normally when you go in on any kind of military or law enforcement operation, everyone knows the protocol. You're supposed to know what your weapon is. They have a serial number. You check it out. You check it back in. There's a certain level of protocol that's followed. None of that was done. Weapons were being passed out randomly. They weren't being recorded when troopers were sent in there. Some of them were told to take off their identifying badges. I mean, it was really a difficult thing. So for some of the troopers, I think frankly, many of the troopers were traumatized by this. I think the troopers committed traumatizing acts because they were put in that position. I also think many of them were traumatized by it. So at the end of the day, the state officials who made this decision, you know, put a lot of people in jeopardy, including many of the corrections officers. Now, we could talk about what might have been a different strategy on what day and how they might have done it, but certainly what did happen, you heard it. It was, as Donnie says, it's like a war zone, you know, and that was a really, really intense time, and certainly for Michael on the catwalk. But also, as you mentioned, right, for Don Noble, who's standing next to you, the two of you who are, if you want to share that story with everybody, I think that's one of the most powerful stories, just to indicate how scary this was, right, when you're sharing. His lovely wife, Sharon Smith, is in the audience, and she lived this on the outside looking in, but you want to tell that story?
Don Noble was a black inmate, and I had met Don when I worked in the metal shop, and one day in the spring of that year, Don approached me and asked me to look at a letter that he and some other inmates had written. And it was, they were going to send it to the Commissioner of Corrections and then Governor of New York State, Rockefeller. And they asked me if I'd stay after that shift and review it, and just give them my thoughts. So I looked at it, and the letter was very respectfully written. And I told them that it was well constructed and that I thought that they should send it to the Commissioner of Corrections and to the Governor. And coincidentally, the initial list of demands was pretty much a representation of what that letter that I was shown several months before contained. Don Noble and another inmate named Carl Rain were the two inmates that protected me when I was being beaten the first day, the initial day of the riot. And when I was taken to the catwalk, Don Noble was also one of my executioners. And he was on my left side with a knife at my throat, a tar paper knife. It's a hooked bladed knife. And Don and I had a serious conversation that morning. And I told him that I was sorry that it came to this, and he also expressed the same sentiments, and we made a mutual exchange of promises to get in touch with. He told me who his family was in New York. I told him who my family was, and we each promised if either one of us made it that we'd express our love to our families after the other was gone. I also said, Don, he was the one with the knife at my throat, and I said, when the time comes, I want, you know what you're doing, I just want this done with. I could see myself up there flopping around like a fish out of water. I didn't want that to happen. I just wanted it to be done. So he promised me that I wouldn't suffer. And that was very consoling to me at the time.
One of the reasons why it's, I know, painful to recount, and also I think for all of us to hear, but one of the things that story always struck me so much, one of the reasons why it always struck me so much is it really does show that in these final hours, when the assault is imminent, that everybody is a sitting duck at that point. And what's important to know is that the negotiations did stall on one key point, and the key point was amnesty. Mm-hmm. And the governor of New York said very clearly, I will not give amnesty. And so then several of the observers said, including Republican State Senator John Dunn, they called the governor and they said, can you at least come to Attica? Not into the prison, not into the yard, but can you at least come to Attica, stand out there and assure these men that if they release the hostages, that they will not be beaten, they will not have reprisals, they will not all be charged with felony murder, that you'll actually investigate the crime. Can you just come? And he said no. You know, in many respects, he was not willing to budge an inch. And it was over this issue of amnesty that it all ultimately leads to this really bloody retaking. And the reason that's so important to understand is that ultimately, you fast forward to 1976, and Don mentions this, ultimately, this goes on for years and years and decades and decades and decades, the story, the investigations into Attica and so forth, and ultimately, amnesty is exactly what happened. Ultimately, the subsequent 2 governors later, governor of New York, Hugh Carey, in effect, does exactly what Rockefeller could have done, which is he said, we're going to close the book on Attica. Mistakes were made. We aren't going to charge any members of law enforcement for crimes committed there, and we are going to vacate the indictments against any inmates. We're going to put this thing to rest. And to me, that's one of the greatest ironies here, because as Don and Mike are up on that catwalk, and as this Don is terrified in the yard, and his men were terrified running around being shot. Mind you, there's also a helicopter circulating saying, surrender with your hands up and you won't be hurt. Mm-hmm. And all you can hear is da-da-da-da-da. You know, so this was just a crazy situation that in many respects, I believe, having, you know, worked on this for a decade and having a 1,400-page manuscript of details from all angles on this, I think it was avoidable.
Can you set up our next artifact? We have a phone conversation between Governor Rockefeller and President Nixon. Can you just give us a couple of words to set up what we're about to hear?
So Governor Rockefeller was just a very quick, important historical note. Governor Rockefeller was known as a quite liberal Republican in the state of New York, but he always had designs on the presidency. He very much wanted to have the Republican nod for the presidency. That went to Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon had a reputation as being much tougher on crime, much firmer on those issues, and Rockefeller was very interested in shoring up his own credentials in that sense. And people have often thought that Attica was his way to do that, to not broker any, to not bow down to inmates in any way. So on the day of the retaking, when they finally speak, which is what I assume you're going to play, yes. You know, it's clear to the architects, of this retaking that it has been a disaster. You have hostages that have been killed. You have many inmates that have been killed. It's a bloodbath. It's a disaster. But what the state of New York does is it goes out in front of the public, and it looks everyone in the eye, reporters from the New York Times, LA Times, and it says, the reason why hostages were killed is that inmates slit their throat. It's not what happened. And that story became the story for quite some time. It changed the way people understood what had happened here. But when he calls Nixon, Nixon doesn't quite know that that's not the story yet, and he kind of congratulates him on a job well done. Then there's another conversation that they have where it's clear that it's not exactly the way Rockefeller said it had been. And he says, Nixon says, well, all I want to know is one thing. Was it a black thing? And Rockefeller says, oh, well, yes, sir. Yes, Mr. President, indeed it was. And basically, that's all Nixon had to know. And that's kind of the underbelly of this story that I also think is worth telling.
Let's listen to this clip. This is a conversation between Governor Rockefeller and President Nixon.
I have Governor Rockefeller for you, sir.
Hello.
There you are.
Mr. President, I know you've had a hard day, but I want you to know that I just back you to the hilt. And I was sitting here talking to Bob Haldeman. I didn't get your call because I've had a cabinet meeting, and then I had a meeting with business leaders right afterwards, and I've been just got out. But the courage you showed and the judgment in not granting amnesty, it was right, and I don't care what the hell the papers or anybody else says. I don't care what they say. I think that you had to do it that way, because if you would have granted amnesty in this case, it would have meant that you would have had prisons in an uproar all over this country.
That's right.
And you did the right thing. It's a tragedy that these poor fellows are shot, but I just want you to know that's my view, and I've told the troops around here there to back that right to the hilt.
Well, aren't you great, Mr. President?
You just reacted to hearing it once again. These poor fellows were shot.
Yeah.
Oops.
The poor fellow, oops.
Yeah.
And that's exactly how they looked at it.
Yeah.
You know, we were expendable. We could be replaced. You know, and they did replace us. Those that got killed, they hired more people. You know? And unfortunately, people that are hearing this now and reading like Dr. Thompson's book and books that have been written on Attica really can't believe until they come to a thing like this and like listen to Mike and myself, John, who have actually lived it, and tell them, we have no reason to lie.
That's right.
This is what they did. And the story about what they did to the widows is even worse than what they did to us when they shot us.
Take a couple of minutes and tell us a little bit about your organization, the Forgotten Victims of Attica, and I'm going the wrong way. I'm sorry.
Well, that's okay.
Yeah.
I mean, we're both part of it. But
Right. And what awareness you're raising now, and what response you get?
The Forgotten Victims of Attica is a pretty grassroots movement made up of correctional officers, hostages, and the families of those killed during the riot. And it was somewhat formed at the time that the inmates eventually, the inmates were given a ward directed by the federal government to New York State to be given a settlement. They were actually wards of the state, so it was the state's responsibility to protect them, essentially. They were successful somewhat in the court system, and eventually they were given a $12 million settlement by the state of New York. The widows and the hostages and the people that worked for the state of New York never received anything. Nothing. They got screwed through the New York State compensation process of any legal recourse as far as a court justice recourse. That was eliminated. The state eliminated that through deceptively through the workman's compensation process. Heather alluded earlier that this kind of canted everyone's view, the public view of what happened. The inmates didn't have guns. Everybody died of gunshot wounds, with the exceptions of, not slit throats, with the exceptions of the 3 inmates that the inmates killed and Bill Quinn. Everybody else died from gunshot wounds. It was reported on the morning that they retook it, and it was printed in the AP. It was reported that I was emasculated and that my testicles were stuffed in my mouth. It never happened. I was never assaulted. I still had my clothes on. I was never stripped.
But the consequences of this, the consequences of the state lying were so dramatic and ongoing. The man that had been accused of doing that to Michael was tortured for 6 hours for having done this crime to him that didn't happen. In addition to that, the widows, as Don mentions, I mean, those are horrendously treated. Essentially, right afterwards, when people are grieving, people are horrified. They've just lost their husbands, their fathers. The state shows up with these meager, meager checks that look exactly like the regular paychecks. You know, here, Mrs. So-and-so, this will tide you over. And of course, some of these women, you know, they had many children to feed. You'll be fine. This will keep you going for a little while. And they never told those women that if they signed those checks and cashed them, which they all did but one, of course they did, why wouldn't you, that they would be statutorily ineligible to sue the state of New York. And they literally lied to them. And they literally, they broached all protocol to do that. And so when I say that the lies, I mean, they ended up affecting everybody so dramatically that that's one of the reasons, frankly, why it's been so hard to tell the story, because for years even the hostages were not sharing stories even with each other. People were scarred from this, right? Both physically and emotionally. It was very hard to even get everyone together to tell the stories, to figure out what had happened.
So years after, when the state made this settlement with the inmates, the hostages and their families got together and said, not that the inmates didn't deserve something, but really. And we formed this grassroots movement, called ourselves the Forgotten Victims of Attica, and spent several years lobbying to the point where we were at least successful in getting a settlement, the same $12 million settlement, to be shared among 65 families for the hostages that the inmates received.
Not until what year? 2005, is that right?
Yeah, 2005.
Yeah. And this happened in 1971, just to give you a sense of how long Attica has lived.
Sure. I'm sure some of you have questions you'd like to ask our panelists. We have 2 volunteers with microphones, so if you get their attention, we'd certainly like to involve you in this conversation. So we're going to start on this side.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Target and the museum, for sponsoring this. I have maybe a 2-part question. The first is, what reforms have occurred since this incident has happened, and do you all think that something like this could happen again, given some of the changes in technology, training, education, operations, and things of that nature?
Who wants to take it? Don, go ahead.
I didn't quite understand the first part.
What reforms took place after this?
Oh, a lot of the whole country. I mean, the whole country changed correction because of Attica. The way they classify inmates, the way they house them, the way they train their employees now. I'm not saying it's the best in the world, but to answer your second part, could it happen again? It could happen tomorrow. It could happen any place in this country. It don't have to be in a big place like Attica. It don't have to be in a small county jail. It could happen tomorrow. When people are locked up, for some reason, they demand a lot more than the people that actually work there. You know, we don't put them there, and we always tell them, we're not here to punish you, but we are here to make sure you don't escape, you don't cause harm to other employees, you don't rape one another, you don't set fires. You know, we didn't put them there. All we're doing is a job. And, you know, and I know in the 30 years that I did in Attica, in the career ladder, you're maybe on the 2nd rung from the bottom. You are definitely not at the top when you're a correction officer. Troopers are, you know, they're highly respected. Correction officers do the worst job in the world, and they get the least amount of gratitude or satisfaction, other than the fact that some of them make a lot of good money.
Given the fact that you've got 2 populations spending their waking hours in one environment, one watching over the other, what are the components that are essential to make it a peaceful environment, even if the pieces are...
For you as an employee, when you walk out of that jail at night, you have to leave everything back there. You don't take it home to your family. You don't take it to the local bar and drink all night. You have to remember, you got a job, you're expected to do certain things, and you are held accountable for anything that you do, be it right or wrong. If you're in a state van, you're transporting inmates and you're speeding, you're accountable. You know, you're not allowed to speed just because you got inmates in the van. You know, if altercations happen, and they do happen, you have to protect yourself. And I believe the law reads you're allowed to use as much force as necessary to subdue the inmate. I believe that still stands. It did when I worked there for 30 years, but I've been gone for 15. I don't know what happens.
Mike, one outcome was the launch of emergency response training for corrections officers. Did that go far enough? Has that been protection against an uncontrolled situation like erupted at Attica?
I agree with Donnie that it could still happen at any time, but the improvements in security, the advancements in technology have made the institutions much more secure. When I worked there, though, it was kind of a transitional period, and it was still an oxymoron, but it was like a correction. They call it a correctional facility or prison. It's an industry now. It's an industry. It's not, I don't know the answers, but I know as a society that this doesn't work. You can't lock something in a cage, someone in a cage, and not give them the tools to improve themselves or the opportunity. They have to want to, and they have to work for it. But if you take that opportunity away from them, they're not going to come out of that cage a better person and better able to contribute to society and the betterment of all of us.
If I could just say something about that, I think that question was really an important question, because I actually think that it's kind of a mixed bag what happened after Attica, at least initially, right? And again, I'm speaking at this kind of looking at it from the macro view. Initially after Attica, there were a lot of major reforms passed, both for correction officer safety, but also for prison conditions. And indeed, even within the first 5 years, there's something like $10 million was allotted for this kind of reform. But then something else happened, which is kind of this more tough on crime ethos took over the nation. And over the next 30 to 40 years, we then became the nation that locked up more people than any other country on the globe. If you look at how many people, the rise in the prison rate in the 30 years before Attica, it's not particularly significant. You know, maybe upwards of about 30,000 people. If you look at the 30 years after Attica, the prison rate goes through the roof. And what's really interesting about that is that this all began, that kind of war on crime began before the murder rate was remarkable, before the crime rate got remarkable. We have the data, we can look at this. And so therefore we began a public policy that at the end of the day, I think has made people actually less safe. So we may have emergency response teams, we may have a lot of new technology in place, but when you have 2 million people locked up in a system, 7.5 million people with a record of, or in the system in some fashion, as Michael says, without any hope, without ever the possibility of getting a job when you get out because you have a record, people in there for decades and decades, often for nonviolent drug offenses, we've created a very unsafe situation for people on the outside, but also people on the inside who have to do this work every day. And I have heard plenty of corrections officers tell me that ironically, that more punitive kind of tough on crime ethos in the prison, you know, take away education, take away this, take away that, actually makes people less safe, not more safe. It makes people angry, it makes them bitter, it makes them unpredictable. And so kind of one of the tragedies, I think, of Attica is that some of the basic, as you said, humanitarian concerns that were raised might have made it a better place for everybody concerned, corrections officers too.
It's interesting. I started my career in television in 1977, and I was reporting on this whole movement that you're talking about. And what I find interesting is that it's very difficult to keep the public's attention at the table discussing the intricacies of prison reform long enough to make some progress. Yeah. And so that as we went down the line, you see, for instance, in California, where they passed as a referendum mandatory sentencing guidelines. Well, if you've got a person who's decided to become a career criminal and he gets that third strike and now he's in for a long sentence, you have probably upped his life expectancy, but you're going to have to pay for him. Yeah. And they went ahead bankrupting themselves, putting people in jail for long periods of time for nonviolent offenses and that sort of thing, where you get the knee-jerk reaction from the public and trying to do prison reform in the ballot box, which really didn't work. Right. What do you need to get our attention to really participate? I mean, because you've got the corrections officers and the law enforcement community, you've got the political community, but it's we the people.
I think it's happening. You know, you might all be interested to know, just about 2 weeks ago now, 3 weeks ago, I was here in DC participating in this quite historic, I think, bipartisan summit on criminal justice reform, and I had the opportunity to speak there, and it was quite a remarkable moment. In the same room was, on the one hand, Eric Holder and Cory Booker. On the other hand was Newt Gingrich and, you know, Rand Paul's people. I mean, it was a real kind of coming together of very, very different political points of view, and the one thing that they could all agree on was, as Michael says, this is not working. It's not working for the people that work in the system. It's not working for the people that are in the communities that have been kind of ravaged by these high rates of incarceration. It's not working for anyone. So I'm hoping that even in the next election cycle, that this is going to be much more on the table than it's been in a long time. Some people will be in it because they think it's too expensive. Other people will be in it because they think it's immoral. I mean, there'll be all kinds of reasons why people are in this debate. But I think we are in a turning point, and I think corrections officers have a huge role to play in it because, you know, being there on the front lines day in and day out, their points of view should be heard in this debate, I think.
We have a question on this side. Yes, thank you for your patience.
First, thank you for coming tonight to share this with us. We know it's not easy at all. Second, can you speak to what it was like to go back to work? Especially given the fact that you did not feel supported by your administration?
Well, it wasn't a hard decision to make because if you've ever been to Attica, I didn't live in Attica. I lived 8 miles up the road in a little town of 400 people. There weren't a lot of opportunities for work in the area. When I got out of service, I had worked at my father's garage and filling station. And after taking the job, John and I started about the same time. We had the greatest job in the world. We had a state job. We were going to get a retirement. We had sick days and all that good stuff. Going back to work wasn't that hard because after we did all the funerals and all the courts, and my second son was born, it wasn't an option. I had to go back to work. I mean, I could have still taken more time off. But personally, I wanted to know if I could do it, so I went back to work. Obviously, it worked because I did 30 years.
Michael, how would you respond?
I've been back to the prison to visit, but they found me physically incapacitated. There was a long period of recovery. I was shot in the abdomen 4 times with an AR-15, an automatic weapon. Bullets exploded on impact, went out the back of me. I was also shot in the right arm by a handgun. For me, it was a long, lengthy recovery period, and at the end of which the state decided that I was physically incapacitated to do that job anymore.
Would either of you recommend a career in corrections for a young person trying to figure out what to do with his or her life?
Sure. It's a great career. As long as you go there with the attitude, it's a job, and that's how you have to look at it, as a job. You're not there to punish them. You're not there to correct them. You are there to make sure they stay there, don't escape, start fires, rape one another, all that other stuff. And hopefully you survive 25 years in the great state of New York and they give you a retirement. Mm-hmm. Hopefully.
I think that prison's just a reflection of unresolved issues that we have in our society. It's just a reflection of society and our inability to address that issue successfully, and I think it's an evolutionary thing. When I worked there, I was the only white officer at Attica. There were no Hispanic officers. And when you look at the population breakdown, I was from an urban area, and I pretty well reflect the individual that was there at the time. I came up in a rural community. I'd never lived in an urban community. The inmate was primarily from an urban community, and the most inmates were black, and a lot were Hispanic. It's not two different worlds, but it's two different places that we came from. And I think a lot has changed since then. Now there are black officers, there are Hispanic officers. So I think things are evolving in a positive direction. But like other issues in our society, I think it's a slow process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's go to this side.
Good evening. My name is Floyd Price. I'm the chair of the prison ministry program at the Shiloh Baptist Church here in the district. And the first thing I want to say is thank you for coming. This has to be hard in terms of going back and going through all of this. But I also want to piggyback on what Heather said. I was at a Brookings Institute on mass incarceration, and there were police chiefs and prosecutors from all over the country saying the very same thing that she said. This is not working, so we've got to figure out a better way. The question I wanted to ask is, like, how are the guards doing? It's not guards, correctional officers doing. I just read a book, New Jack, about a New York Times reporter that went into prison, and he felt like he was a prisoner as well as the prisoners. Has that changed? Is that any better?
When I started, it wasn't a very high-paying job, but it was a great job with the retirement and all that. I can't imagine anybody thinking that they're a prisoner when they go to work there because it's their choice. And with the number of jails in New York, and I think there's, what, 50 now? 50 plus or something? You, by your seniority, can transfer to any one of them. You can go to a camp. You don't have to work in Attica. Most people work in Attica because they like it. It's close to home, and it's a good jail. You can work in the little jail behind it. Little jail houses 2,000 inmates, Wyoming. You can go to camps. You can go any place. So you're not stuck. When you go to Attica, you're not stuck there forever. It's your choice if you elect to stay there. You know, and that's where I wanted to work, because when I started, there was only 11 jails. When John and I started, they had 11 jails. And in the 30-year period that we worked, they built 50 jails. They've closed a few of them now, I believe, because budget costs. All that does is put the correction officers in the other jails where they're putting these more people more at risk. You know, all the jails are overcrowded. There's a couple guys here that I know and have worked with from Attica. They can tell you they're overcrowded. You go to work and your ass is on the line every day. It ain't like you go to work and you know it's going to be a good day. The good day is when you get to go home at night. And they never know when they walk in that front door in the places like Attica and Rikers Island and all them big jails. Going home's a good day for you. Sometimes you get to go home in an ambulance. You get the shit kicked out of you. It's just not a great job.
Interesting.
But we all choose to do it because of the benefit package, the retirement down the road, the money you can make on the road if you're a transport officer, you know. And I refer to John, who I live in Florida with. Him and I actually ended up, we were high school friends. His wife graduated with me, and my wife graduated with him. We're still friends. We're friends with Mike and Sharon. You know, it's a bond, and it's not all about Attica, because when we're together, I don't even think we talk about Attica. We have more fun like going to a Mexican restaurant and find out which pepper's the hottest. You know, you know, and that's what we do, and that's how you got to look at it. But you got to remember one thing: when you work in those, and I call them shitholes, and that's what they are, you have to remember that the majority of people that you actually hang with actually work in one or the one you work in. You know, it's just common. Because you have a common denominator. You can talk. They understand that you're nuts, so stuff like that. But it's a good job. I enjoyed it. You know, these guys must enjoy it. They're still working.
Heather, when we sit down in the other part of society to talk about prison reform, there's often this conflict between warehousing, punishment, rehabilitation, which very often people on the outside, especially when employment gets tight, don't want to support.
Right.
How do you reconcile? I mean, those are the stress points that have to be reconciled if we are to make some sort of progress, because clearly the corrections officers know what they're about. They know why they're there and what their job is. And it seems that the political will and the will of the public is what is conflicted.
Well, again, I think that's changing a little bit. I think the gentleman from Prison Ministries said something very important, which is that even people in law enforcement right now are, and I say even because they are in fact employed by this very institution that we're talking about, are becoming critics of it. I was just on a panel with the police chief from Salt Lake City, and he's a real reformer. I mean, he really feels that we just have to start thinking about ways to not send people to prison for every kind of legal infraction, because it's creating too much trauma for the larger society. But you're right, it does raise questions. What about people that depend upon that industry for employment? And one of the ways I think we can think about this is that, you know, we had relatively stable rates of imprisonment throughout our history, and there were correction officer jobs, there were police officer jobs, there were civilian jobs in prisons. Those were always there. But when we have 50 prisons in the state of New York, things have gotten really out of whack. And so Don is absolutely right. The solution can't just be to shut down a prison and cram everybody into another one. That's no solution. It's horrible for the guards working there. It's horrible for the prisoners that live it. So that's not the solution. We have to think about some kind of broader policy shift where we think about other ways of dealing with social ills, as Mike says. We have to think about we should treat drug addiction not as a criminal justice issue, but as a public health issue, right? There are plenty of evil, you know, mental health. There's plenty of evil that a prison could deal with if it needed to. But we are so out of whack. We lock up people who are mentally ill. We lock up people who are addicted. We lock up people because they can't afford bail, because they have no money. That's not a system that even corrections officers want to see. They just want job security. And there's absolutely no reason why we can't have stable correction jobs with decent benefits, decent wages, and absolutely. We just need to do it in a more humane way for the whole society. Because you know what, frankly, you could live in a town like Attica or anywhere, and you could work in a prison, and you could have your job. But if we have a society that's letting out people on a daily basis who have no training, no education, who are drug addicted and mentally ill, then when you come home, it's a little hard to leave all that stuff back at the prison. We have just created a trauma for our society as a whole. So I think law enforcement is very much getting on this page as well.
I think this is probably going to be our last question. Hello?
Thank you again for coming by to speak with us. This has been very informative. Can you briefly talk about what it was like after the riots in Attica? For those of you that went back to work, what was the relationship like between the inmates and the correctional officers now, given that some of the prisoners are still there, you've got guards coming back that went through this traumatic event? What were were there tensions, or what was that relationship like afterwards?
Well, when I went back to work, it was very simple. There was only half the population there. 2 of the blocks have been completely destroyed during the riot, so therefore we had 1,250 inmates instead of 2,500. The tension was still there because it was early '72 and they were starting to do the grand juries and the courts, and some of the inmates that were involved in the riot were there, not too many. The majority of riot leaders had either been killed or transferred. And what they did is, like I said, there was only 11 jails in New York State at the time, and so they were putting them away. I wasn't there when the riot was, when the place was retaken, but I was told that in the 2 housing blocks that were still there and 1 smaller block in the back, they would put 4 or 5 guys in that cell. There's only 1 toilet and 1 bed. They had to house them someplace. They had to get buses in. They had to get their records. They had to find out who was who. They were trying to pick out the ringleaders. You know, like I say, when I went back to work in early January after my 2nd son was born, the majority of those inmates were gone. There was a few of them there. Every once in a while you'd end up in federal court because they'd say, well, he's prejudiced or this because he was in the riot and I was there. You know, the attorneys would say, prove it. You know, and the inmate, he would pro bono himself. He just wanted to go to court. He wanted to be in federal court because he got treated better in federal court than he did the county court. Going back to work, I think the majority of people, when we went back, the officers that were there that knew us, they were more afraid of us than the inmates were because they weren't sure what we were going to do. Matter of fact, I wasn't even allowed to go back into jail at first. I was assigned a construction job, and yet my friend here, they put him in a gun tower with 300 rounds of .308 ammunition covering an evacuation area for the chapel. I couldn't go in the jail with a nightstick. He's got 300 rounds of .308 ammo. I mean, that's the way the state thought. When the response teams were formed in 1972, I put my name in. I was denied by the state of New York. It took the lieutenant 1 year to get me on it. I was put on it in 1973, and I was on it the whole time I was there. I was asked the question if we were ever activated. Oh, hell yeah. We were activated a lot, even in our own jail. Because now, after the riot, we actually had gun coverage in our yards. Before, we had a gas gun at Times Square Upper. And now we have automatic weapons, shotguns, gas guns. The officers feel a little more protected when they look up there and they see certain officers in the yard who they know ain't afraid to fire the gun. Some guys go up there because it's a good job. They know they can hide out. But if you're in that yard and something happens, that officer is obligated to protect your ass, either by shooting the inmate that's attacking you, firing gas to disperse it, or whatever. If he doesn't, he better hope he gets relieved early and gets out before the rest of the shift does. Because he'll get a little parking lot action. And that don't happen too often because those guys that work those jobs, they know what their responsibilities are. And I know when I worked there, nobody would dare do it. And I'm quite sure with the officers that I know at Attica, nobody would work a gun tower if they were afraid to pull the trigger. Nobody goes up there with the intention of killing anybody. But your job is to protect the employees in the yard. And believe it or not, you're also up there to protect the other inmate. So if that inmate's being stabbed and you shoot the guy, it's not an oops, you are supposed to. So it's supposed to save that inmate's butt.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah, it was very good.
Yeah. Don and Michael, thank you for your service. Thank you for coming here and sharing so much with us tonight. Thank you for your advocacy.
Before we go any further, it's Michael's birthday. We got to wish him.
And a happy birthday to
happy
Michael.
Birthday.
It's Michael's birthday. Happy birthday.
Heather, thank you for your research and your insight into this. And we hope that you take some of this information home and share it within your communities, within your families, because once again, this is a societal challenge that is before us, and we need to get it right. And I'm certainly going to share it with my media friends because the media needs to get it right too. And it's something that we're working on, but we still have a long way to go. Thank you so much.
What we have to remember, the media is not always our enemy.
Right.
Sometimes we think they are.
That's right. That's exactly right.
But in all reality, they do give us credit occasionally.
Let me end the story with, to me, this will always be the portrait of a corrections officer. I was working for Channel 9 here in Washington, D.C. We were driving back across town from Washington Hospital Center. We're driving down the street, and I look to the right and to the left, and I see something, and I asked my photographer to circle the block because I want to see if I saw what I thought I saw. And it was a tree that came up with a fork. It went up about 8 feet, and someone had started to carve it like a totem pole. And sure enough, that's what it was. So we went up and we knocked on the door. Man sheepishly opened the door. We asked him if he had done that to the tree. First, he thought we were cops that were going to come to arrest him for messing with the tree. It turns out the city had sent a crew by to cut down a dead tree. We could see the dead tree right there. They cut down a live tree, and they left it, and they asked him, neighbors asked the city to leave the tree up because the man who lives here enjoys working with woodwork and chisels and everything. So it turns out he was a corrections officer at Lorton. And indeed, he had started to work with woodwork and chisels and everything. So he saw this as an opportunity to carve out indicators of the spiritual and physical side of man. And so on this side at the top was a bear, on this top was an angel. And he said over the last 2 months he'd been working on this, he had met more of his neighbors who would come out and suggest themes for him that with all the various ethnicities in the neighborhood that were represented there, and he would do in bands around the tree. And he explained to us that he works at Lorton, it's a pressure cooker during the day, and when he comes home, this is his release. He gets into the spiritual place that allows him to meet people, and he felt so good about this, and he's contributing to his community. That's a corrections officer. And I'll never forget that, and I was just so glad that I was able to see that. We put him on the air that night. We did a story on him, because people don't see that side of what you guys are and what you do, and we thank you for what you are and for what you do. Thank you.